But but we're so pleased everybody is here. Thanks so much, for those of you who are here to see this panel. I know I sure can't wait to hear what our panelists have to say. And so, with no further ado, I will simply introduce Dr. Woodyard from Northern Illinois University. Thank you so much, Dr. Woodyard.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, but before I do, I just want to thank Dr. Johnson for the opportunity and for everyone for being here. Uh, and I'll just get this. No, here we go. All right. Everyone see that all right? Okay, good. Thank you. My paper is titled The Wolverton Bible and Race, Visions of Chosenness, Segregation, and Sin. I was trying to advance my slides here. Let me see if I'm able to navigate. Okay. In his 2017 memoir, The World in Flames, Gerald Walker recounts how, as an African-American child raised in the worldwide Church of God, he used this illustration of people afflicted with painful boils as inspiration for a one-on-one sermon he delivered to his neighborhood friend Paul in late 1971. Convinced of his church's apocalyptic teachings about the Great Tribulation, Walker, then just 8 years old, preached that suffering like this awaited all those who failed to follow God's laws. Young Jerry hoped to convert Paul so that Paul in turn could convert his parents, and so they could all, in Walker's words, be spared the torture and suffering headed their way. The illustration was drawn by comic book legend Basil Wolverton, best known for his zany and grotesque illustrations published in Mad magazine. The illustration found its way into Walker's childhood home in the pages of a church publication written by evangelist Herbert W. Armstrong, founder of the Worldwide Church of God. My paper investigates the collaborative relationship between Basil Wolverton and Herbert W. Armstrong, focusing on a selection of the hundreds of biblical illustrations that Armstrong commissioned Wolverton to produce for the Worldwide Church of God between 1953 and 1974. As I argue, these images were not just artistic interpretations of Scripture, they were tools of religious instruction that reinforced Armstrong's theological vision, including his racial teachings on chosenness, segregation, and sin. Over the next several minutes, first I'll briefly provide some background on Armstrong, Wolverton, and the Worldwide Church of God. Then, to provide some textual focus, I'll draw your attention to 3 of Wolverton's illustrations depicting the flood in Genesis and discuss these in the context of Armstrong's racial theology. And finally, I'll offer some concluding remarks on how these images reinforced white supremacist ideology and why they matter today. Herbert W. Armstrong believed that the modern world was on the brink of catastrophe, a life and death emergency that required urgent action. As a radio evangelist and magazine editor, he spent decades warning audiences about the coming tribulation. But as time went on, he realized that mere words, whether broadcasted around the globe in his World Tomorrow radio program or printed in his Plain Truth magazine, were not enough to make people truly grasp the magnitude of what he saw as inevitable devastation. As Armstrong admitted, mere words have not made people realize what God reveals for the future. To solve this problem, Armstrong turned to Basil Wolverton, a nationally known comic book artist, a devoted follower of Armstrong's teachings, and an ordained elder in the Worldwide Church of God. Wolverton's role was not just that of an illustrator. He was tasked with bringing Armstrong's apocalyptic vision to life in a way that would shock and compel his audience. Beginning in the October 1954 issue of The Plain Truth, Armstrong introduced Wolverton's sensational pictures. Graphic, grotesque depictions of divine punishment meant to make readers, children and adults, really see what was about to ensnare them, as Armstrong said, as rats in a trap. In this way, Wolverton and Armstrong's vision for biblical illustration was radically different from the sentimental children's Bible books popular in the 1950s. They insisted on a brutally faithful retelling, one that did not sanitize or omit the terrifying consequences of sin. But Armstrong's teaching were not just about prophecy. His theology was also deeply intertwined with ideas of race, nation, and divine favoritism. He was a proponent of British Israelism, a belief system that identified so-called Anglo-Saxon nations as the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. For Armstrong, America's wealth and power were not just historical accidents. They were proof of divine chosenness, evidence of God's special favor, the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Yet, this belief had profound implications. If America's prosperity was a sign of God's blessing, then the means by which that wealth was accumulated through colonial expansion, economic exploitation, and slavery had to be justified within his theology. Armstrong's narrative implicitly sanctioned these histories, either as necessary steps in fulfilling prophecy or as divinely orchestrated events. In this worldview, racial segregation and national supremacy weren't just social or political issues. They were sacred and unchangeable principles embedded in God's plan. Understanding the collaboration between Armstrong and Wolverton helps us see how their work was not just about illustrating the Bible. It was about shaping a particular racialized apocalyptic vision of both the past and the future. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at 3 of Wolverton's biblical illustrations, focusing on how they visually reinforce Armstrong's teachings on race and divine judgment. Let's begin with Wolverton's depiction of Noah. In Armstrong's theology, Noah was not just righteous, he was white, descended from a white Adam made in God's image. Armstrong argued that Noah was chosen because he had remained pure, while the rest of humanity had fallen into sin. But what was this sin? Wolverton's caption tells us that Noah was, quote, the one man who lived according to God's laws, but it does not specify what those laws were. Armstrong, however, makes it explicit. Writing in 1963, in the wake of the Civil Rights March on Washington, Armstrong wrote in The Plain Truth, "Did you know that they were having race riots and large-scale racial violence in Noah's day? Before the flood? It will come as a shock to many to learn that this very intermarriage of the races and the violence of race hatreds was the prime reason for God's action in bringing the flood on that world." This is a troubling and crucial connection. Armstrong presents interracial marriage not just as a social problem, but as an ultimate transgression, so severe that God wiped out nearly all of humanity because of it. Wolverton's illustration of Noah as the righteous remnant visually supports this argument, reinforcing the idea that whiteness and racial purity are synonymous with divine favor. The next images take this argument even further. Here, Wolverton depicts people drowning in terror, with clawing hands, their faces twisted in agony as they realize they are doomed. These are some of Wolverton's most haunting images. Do these people know what they are being punished for? Perhaps not. But again, Armstrong provides the answer, writing, quote, There was something drastically wrong, criminally wrong, that would soon prove fatally wrong unless God cut it short. Something with the way they were marrying and reproducing. The world has never realized the reason for the flood. In other words, Armstrong asserts that interracial unions were the direct cause of divine wrath. The visual of the drowning masses, juxtaposed with Noah's salvation, turns this theological claim into something felt and seen, where Wolverton's images function as more than just religious illustration. They serve as racial propaganda, reinforcing Armstrong's segregationist worldview. Though Wolverton's illustration and Armstrong's teachings, through them, these illustrations and Armstrong's teachings, we see a theological framework in which racial separation is not just justified, but divinely ordained. Armstrong insisted that the worldwide Church of God did not endorse racial discrimination and that it would not, in his words, quote, take sides in the race issue. But Armstrong drew a sharp distinction between discrimination and segregation, arguing that the two were entirely different. In this framework, segregation was not about oppression, but about divine order, an order that could not be disrupted by human intervention. Armstrong warned that man-made attempts to address racial injustice, such as the civil rights movement, were not only misguided, but dangerous. Armstrong claimed that only God could correct oppression in his own way and in his own time, and any efforts to force integration would lead to violence, war, and divine wrath. This position allowed Armstrong and his followers to reject the push for racial equality while framing their stance as one of spiritual obedience rather than racial animus. So, in conclusion, Armstrong and Wolverton's theological project was not merely a collection of eccentric beliefs or harmless doctrinal quirks, as is too often asserted. Their work actively contributed to the maintenance and reproduction of white supremacist ideology, embedding racial segregation into a prophetic vision of divine order. Through Wolverton's striking illustrations and Armstrong's sermons, their audience was not simply taught to fear an impending apocalypse. They were also instructed on who, in God's eyes, was meant to inherit the world to come and who was not. Of course, the power of this message extended beyond its white architects. Returning to Gerald Walker's childhood sermon, we see him, a young African-American boy standing before his friend, passionately preaching Wolverton's grotesque vision of divine punishment. He did so not in defiance of the church's racial ideology, but as a believer in it, passing along Armstrong's warnings as truth. This moment encapsulates the deeply insidious nature of Armstrong and Wolverton's collaboration, not just in shaping white audiences' views on race, but in convincing those excluded from their vision of God's kingdom to see themselves through its lens. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Woodyard. That was very sobering. Um, I am now pleased to introduce Rohan Samuels from Kairos University. Uh, Dr. Samuels, are you with us?
Hi, yes, I am. Just wanted to are you able to hear me clearly? Awesome. I do apologize. My wife literally just gave birth 2 days ago, and so I am here somewhere in the hallway. So I do apologize if you hear any sort of background noise at the hospital. So my apologies beforehand. Let us begin. And just to confirm, I know that we've talked about the 15-minute time slot. Is that still required?
I, So I think that our third presenter is not going to be here today, so you probably have some extra time if you would like to use it, but no pressure, if you've planned on 15 to 20. But you probably have extra available to you if you'd like it.
Sure, awesome. Okay, again, thank you so much, um, Dr. Johnson, and to all of the required uh, colleagues, um, and all of our guests, I suppose, that are joining us this morning for this awesome conference. It is my first time, and I'm excited. Again, my apologies for showing up late. There's just a lot of things that I just had to pivot through. So please accept my apologies. Um, but yeah, so one of the things I want to explore and kind of talk about is on the topic of reclaiming racial epistemology. And this is a historical and theological analysis of race from 17th century to Du Bois' Negro experience. Again, for the sake of just the craziness that has been happening, I don't have a presentation PowerPoint prepared. So again, I apologize before that as well.
That's fine.
So today I invite you to thank you to engage in a critical examination of racial epistemology, how knowledge about race has been constructed, contested, and reclaimed. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his seminal work, The Conservation of Race, has posed fundamental questions about the meaning and development of race. And his reflections challenge us to interrogate how race has been historically framed, particularly in the intersections of theology, philosophy, and socio-political structures. Excuse me. Race, as Du Bois understood it, is not simply a biological or genetic marker, but a lived reality. I would even say a socio-political construct deeply embedded in power, culture, and identity. And in this presentation, I will trace the historical trajectory of race beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries with the emergence of racial classifications before turning to theological justifications such as the curse of Ham. And so this discussion will illustrate how racial epistemology evolved from European classifications of humanity to theological constructs that justified racial hierarchies. And finally, we will return to Du Bois' challenge. And the challenge is, how do we reclaim racial epistemology in ways that resist colonial knowledge structures and affirm Black intellectual traditions? So let's kind of explore, um, uh, one moment. Okay, here we go. So there are three critical dimensions I want to explore. As I said before, number one, the conceptualization of race in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so we're going to be focusing on the emergence of early racial classificatory models and their entanglement with European colonial expression, scientific racism, and Enlightenment epistemologies. Number two, the theological framework of the Curse of Ham, analyzing its role in shaping racial hierarchies, legitimizing slavery, and embedding racialized theology within Western thought. And then lastly, Du Bois' critique on racial essentialism, assessing his contribution to racialized epistemology that reclaims Black subjectivity and disrupts hegemonic knowledge production. Okay, so let's kind of explore the concept of race in the 17th, 18th centuries. The formalization of race as a classificatory system is often attributed to Francis Bernier, whose 1684 essay, A New Division of Earth According to the Different Species or Race of Men, who inhabited it, proposed a taxonomy based on phenotypical traits. Bernier's framework marked a decisive moment in the history of racial thought as it sought to impose hierarchical order upon human diversity by categorizing populations according to observable physical attributes, skin color, hair texture, and facial features. His approach, although rudimentary rather, foreshadowed the emergence of scientific racism as it laid the foundation for subsequent Enlightenment thinkers to codify race within a biologized framework of human difference. And while Benier's model reflected the broader Enlightenment era impulse to systematize knowledge, it also signaled a crucial epistemic shift in the conceptualization of race. So in medieval Europe, human difference had primarily been understood through religious and cultural lenses, with lineage and ancestry functioning as primary markers of identity. However, with the rise of European colonial expansion, the transatlantic slave trade, and the growing influence of natural philosophy, race transitioned from being a flexible lineage based category, often linked to nobility and heritage, to an ostensibly immutable biological condition. And so this shift was not merely descriptive, it was profoundly prescriptive, as it provided a pseudoscientific rationale for emerging racial hierarchies, particularly the subjugation of African and indigenous peoples. Crucially, race in this period was not simply a matter of physical classification, but was deeply entangled with evolving epistemological frameworks in natural history, theology, and political theory. As Claude Olivier Doran suggests, and he notes this: race and racism must be understood as distinct historical phenomena. Right? Racial taxonomies were not merely the product of personal prejudice, but were embedded within a broader ideological project that sought to justify European imperial expansion, chattel slavery, and socio-political stratification. Race, in this sense, became both a descriptive and normative category deployed to classify human populations while simultaneously legitimizing asymmetrical power relations. And one significant site of epistemological development in the 17th and 18th centuries was theological discourse, as we would know, particularly interpretations of the biblical curse of Ham, which is located in Genesis 9, 18 through 27. This passage was increasingly weaponized by European theologians and intellectuals to construct a divine justification for Black enslavement, further entrenching race within a theological framework of moral and civilizational hierarchy. And so the ideological fusion of religious doctrine with emergent racial science produced a potent justification for colonial domination, wherein Blackness was equated with servitude of whiteness with divine favor. Thus, the racialization of theology did not merely reflect existing prejudice, it actively contributed to the institutionalization of race as an enduring structure of power and exclusion. And so by the late 18th century, these classificatory projects reached a new levels of sophistication in the works of Carl Linnaeus, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and also Comte de Buffon. And so within Linnaeus's Systema Naturae in 1735, he kind of produced this work. He categorized humans into hierarchical racial groups, while Johann Blumenbach, within his work on the natural varieties of humankind in 1775, introduced the now infamous five-race schema, with Europeans positioned at the apex of human development. And so these taxonomies did not emerge in an intellectual vacuum. They were deeply informed by socio-political realities of European expansionism, the transatlantic slave economy, and the economic imperatives of racial capitalism. As such, the development of race in the 17th and 18th centuries cannot be reduced to an abstract intellectual exercise. It was, at its core, a project of power designed to regulate human differences in service of colonial and capitalistic interests. So this period thus represents a pivotal movement in the history of racial epistemology, in which race was transformed from mutable social contingent identity into a fixed biological category, rather, that would shape centuries of racial thought. And so the enduring legacy of this shift is evident in the ways racial discourse continues to structure global hierarchies, making it imperative to critically interrogate its historical origins. As we observe The second sort of discourse, or at least category for this matter, is the curse of Ham in early Jewish, Christian, and medieval thought. The curse of Ham narrative derived, as I mentioned, from Genesis 9:20 through 27. And this has played a foundational role in the racialization of theology, serving as a potent ideological mechanism for legitimizing social hierarchy and racial subjugation. Though the biblical passage itself recounts an incident between Noah and his son Ham, culminating in the cursing of Ham's son Canaan to servitude, it was later reinterpreted and weaponized to justify the enslavement of African descended peoples. The mythologization of this curse exemplifies how religious hermeneutics, when aligned with sociopolitical narratives and imperatives, can be mobilized to produce epistemologies of racial domination. So early Jewish and Christian exegetes engage in speculative interpretations of this text, often linking Ham's descendants with blackness and servitude. And so the conflation of the curse of Ham with racial identity was not an inherent feature of biblical text, but an exegetical innovation shaped by broader cultural and historical forces. As David Goldenberg has demonstrated in his work, early rabbinic literature and medieval Christian commentary did not initially racialize Ham's descendants. Rather, the association of blackness with divine punishment emerged gradually as European encounters with Africa intensified. So by the early modern period, Christian scholars had fused biblical interpretation with pre-existing notions of European superiority, providing theological justification for racial hierarchy. Stephen Haynes traces how Genesis 9, this narrative became one of the most powerful ideological tools of the colonial and imperial era. In the wake of European expansion and the transatlantic slave trade, the curse of Ham was systematically reinterpreted to support this racial capitalist order. Although the biblical text makes no explicit connection between Ham's lineage and Black Africans, European theologians and intellectuals selectively reimagined the passage to affirm an emergent racial schema. And so the erasure of Canaan from many later interpretations, despite the curse being explicitly directed to him, reveals the extent to which biblical narratives were manipulated to align with pre-existing social hierarchies. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the curse of Ham had been fully racialized within both theological and secular discourse, becoming a cornerstone of pro-slavery apologetics in Europe and the Americas. Protestant and Catholic theologians alike reinforce the idea that African enslavement was divinely sanctioned, embedding racial hierarchy within the Christian doctrine. And this theological racialization was not merely an incidental byproduct of slavery, it actively shaped the epistemological frameworks through which race was understood and institutionalized. The fusion of religious discourse with emergent pseudo-scientific racial taxonomies cemented a powerful narrative in which whiteness was equated with divine favor and blackness with perpetual servitude. And so therefore, this epistemological entanglement between theology and race did not remain confined to the pre-modern world, certainly not. The racialized exegesis of Genesis 9 persisted well into the modern period, influencing the racial ideology that figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois would later challenge. Du Bois, in resisting essentialist notion of race, sought to dismantle the theological and philosophical constructs that had long upheld racial hierarchy. The enduring legacy of the curse of Ham narrative illustrates the power of biblical interpretation in shaping social realities, both historically and in contemporary racial discourse. Consequently, the theological justification of race continues to demand critical interrogation as its residues persist in modern structures of racialized knowledge and power. And now transitioning into Du Bois and the reclamation of racial epistemology. It is important to know that Du Bois stands at the vanguard of racial epistemology, challenging the dominant formulations of race that had been constructed through centuries of Enlightenment rationality, colonial domination, and theological justification. Excuse me, rather than passively accepting the externally imposed racial taxonomies that sought to fix Blackness within a framework of inferiority, Du Bois reframed race as a site of epistemic struggle, one that demanded both intellectual and existential reclamation. His concept of the Negro experience is therefore not merely an articulation of racial identity, but a radical epistemological intervention that reclaims race from the distortions of white supremacy. Du Bois' critique is both structural and phenomenological, resisting the reduction of Black identity to biologically deterministic categories while simultaneously exposing the ideological function of race in the maintenance of global racial hierarchies. First, he dismantles biological essentialism, arguing that race is not an immutable genetic reality, but a socially and historically produced construct. In The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903, he articulates the idea that race derives its significance not from inherent biological difference, rather, but from the collective experiences, cultural traditions, and shared histories that shape Black life. And this argument directly challenges the pseudoscientific racial classifications of the 18th and 19th centuries, which had sought to anchor racial distinctions in fixed hierarchical categories. Second, Du Bois interrogates the ideological deployment of race, exposing its instrumentalization as a tool of social control. He argues that racial categories have not only been used to justify the marginalization of Black communities, but have also been strategically wielded to structure systems of power and domination. The construction of race in Du Bois' analysis is always entangled with political economy, colonial expansion, and the epistemic violence of Western modernity. In his later work, particularly Black Reconstruction in America in 1935, he extends his analysis by demonstrating how racial myths were deliberately constructed to fracture working class solidarity and uphold capitalistic exploitation. For Du Bois, then, the reclamation of race has an epistemological category in both a scholarly and a political imperative. He insists that any meaningful understanding of race must emerge from the lived realities of Black people rather than from the distorted lens of Eurocentric knowledge production. This epistemological shift marks a profound departure from the dominant discourses of his time, repositioning Black subjectivity as central to the production of knowledge. His call for a second sight, the ability of Black people to see themselves both through their own self-affirmation and through the oppressive gaze of white supremacy, reflects his deep engagement with the existential dimensions of race. Du Bois' intervention remains foundational for contemporary debates on racial epistemology, as his work prefigures later critiques by scholars such as Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, and Paul Gilroy, who continue to interrogate the ways in which race operates as a constructed yet materially consequential category. His insistence on centering Black experience as a legitimate site of knowledge production challenges not only scientific racism, but also the broader epistemic erasures perpetrated by the academy. As contemporary scholars seek to deconstruct racial myths and affirm the multiplicity of Black identities, Du Bois' framework offers a critical foundation for understanding race not as an essentialized given, but as historically situated, culturally rich, and politically contested construct. And therefore, as I conclude, the history of racial epistemology is marked by a dialectical tension between the construction of race as a tool of domination and its contestation as a site of resistance. from Francis Benier's early classificatory models to the theological mythos of Curse of Ham, race has functioned as an instrument of social stratification, systematically deployed to justify hierarchies of power and exclusion. And these epistemological frameworks emerging at the nexus of the Enlightenment, rationality, colonial expansion, and religious exegesis did not simply describe human difference, they actively produced and institutionalized racial structures of oppression. However, Du Bois so powerfully demonstrates race is not merely a construct imposed from above, it is also a contested terrain, a site of resistance, reclamation, and redefinition. Du Bois challenged us to see race not as an immutable essence, but as an historically situated construct that has been shaped by hegemonic forces, yet remains open to radical transformation. His intervention signals an epistemic rupture and shift in the study of race from the domain of external classification to an arena where Black subjectivity, historical agency, and lived experiences become central. And so this presentation has traced the evolution of racial epistemology from the 17th century, quite briefly, to Du Bois' intervention, underscoring how race has been shaped by historical, theological, and socio-political forces. By critically engaging these narratives, we eliminate the ways in which racial categories have been both weaponized and resisted, revealing the necessity of reclaiming racial knowledge on our own terms. The deconstruction of race as a fixed biological category must therefore be accompanied by an insistence on race as a site of epistemological agency, one that affirms Black life, culture, and intellectual traditions. Du Bois' insights remain as urgent today as they were in the 19th and early 20th centuries. His call to interrogate race critically compels us to move beyond static definition and towards a dynamic, historically conscious engagement with racial identity. In an era where racial discourse continues to oscillate between essentialist reductionism and neoliberal colorblindness, Du Bois' framework offers a crucial reminder that race is not merely an artifact of history, but an ongoing epistemic battleground. Reclaiming racial epistemology then is not only a scholarly imperative, but a political and ethical one, an act of intellectual insurgency, if you will, against the structures of erasure and subjugation that persist in the modern world. And therefore, to engage in this work is to continue the unfinished project of racial liberation, not merely by critiquing race's historical construction, but by envisioning new epistemological paradigms, one that affirms the plurality, complexity, and agency of racialized people. This is the challenge and promise of racial epistemology, not as a tool of oppression, but as a means of liberation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samuels. All right. Well, we have about 35 minutes left allotted. Just kind of a programming note. I think it's still kind of up in the air, but our third presenter, Anthony Joseph Lucchini, I believe he is going to give his presentation at a later time during his conference. So we'll try to communicate that information when it's known.
We did get confirmation.
Okay.
Jeff, thank you for that. He will present today at 3 o'clock.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So do be sure to be here for that. We have some time for some questions for our panelists, for Dr. Woodyard and for Dr. Samuels. Do we have some questions?
I don't have a question. I just want to make a comment. I believe both of the panelists made strong cases and arguments for the Center for the Study of Rhetoric, Race, and Religion. When this is exactly what I'm talking about, when these embedded narratives get into the lifeblood, if you will, of a nation or a society, a world even, people begin to operate on these ideologies. Michael Calvin McGee will call them ideographs. And when we begin to operate on them, we begin to look at them as truisms, like this has fallen from the sky, and we would do ourselves a favor to interrogate some of these and to demonstrate where they're coming from. So, great historical work, great grounding about race. And a lot of times, again, many folk in religion do not talk about race shaping the very foundation that you think that the very foundation that you that you believe in, the framework that you believe in, that you will honestly, believe is the right position is already racialized. And it's just, you don't know it. And so I just want to commend our panelists for unearthing that both in print and, of course, in art, which has we don't talk enough about either. But I'll stop right there. I can go on.
I see a virtual hand from the wonderful and talented Jackie Lyde from the Duquesne University. Jackie.
Thank you, Jeff. Both great job for both of you. I ditto what Dr. Johnson said. Very powerful presentations. I guess my question can be for both of you, but more directed at Rohan, in that, do you see a place in this current historical moment for a change to occur?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, absolutely. I believe change is occur. I would stretch it and say that any sort of alteration of, and I'm gonna just use the framework of the language of my presentation. Any sort of transformation of epistemology is inevitable. One of the things I critique, especially in my dissertation, is this notion of epistemological shifts that had occurred from, let's say, pre-modern to modernity to post-modernity. Post-modernity is exactly where I really focus my research. And as we look throughout the epistemological landscape, there has always been change. Now, granted, if we're asking if there's change where the framework of thinking of marginalized groups to be equated with dominant hegemonic spaces and groups, I guess only history can tell us. And maybe we can just pray and hope. I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, but I believe it starts with not even so much what we do as it is much more about how we think, how we produce our knowledge, how we value our knowledge production. And one of the ways I explore this is to identify that, for example, for many of us, like for me, who matriculated in predominant Western universities, is that much of my knowledge production was formed in that. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. However, I believe in order for us to, quote unquote, identify a change, to which what we would have to identify what that change is, we're going to have to reclaim, we're going to have to redefine that the Eurocentric dominated knowledge production, how we receive knowledge, how we formulate our knowledge frameworks, is not just solely relegated to that, right? We have to embrace Afro-Caribbean, if you're Afro-Latino, whatever the case may be. Those other knowledge spaces, those other knowledge productions are just as valued. There isn't just a single epistemological paradigm. And so, short answer is that it's possible. However, it's going to require a lot of reclaiming, a lot of redefinition, a lot of reframing of how we believe knowledge production is arrived at, received, and someone else as well too communicated.
Thank you.
I'll just add, really starting with where I'm looking at this particular text and this controversy and the question around, is there a place in the current moment for change? And I think yes, there is. One of the things that I think I'm sitting with now is a sense of how much the entrenchment of marginalization and hierarchies of oppression relies on a kind of cultural forgetting or amnesia, an erasure of things that have actually occurred. And I see that in what I'm looking at with Armstrong and Wolverton, that sort of the public memory of these figures seems to leave out what I talked about today. And I find that troubling. And I think in order to confront and make forward change, there has to be a recognition of what's true. And I think that sort of connects to the current moment where I'm seeing, or we're all seeing, kind of a push to pretend that certain things aren't true. And so, yeah, I think that's all I have right now. But thank you for the question. It's thought-provoking.
Dr. Wood, you have ideas about how that cultural forgetting has been so absolutely accomplished? Like, I mean, it seems like I've never heard, uh, of some of this that you've shared with us. How do you have any ideas about how they've managed to memory hole that so completely?
Yeah, I think memory hole is a good apt term for this. In the case of Basil Wolverton, he's much more known as a comic book artist who, published for Mad Magazine and a bunch of different comic books, and so that seems to be, what he's known for. And I think even comic book fans are less familiar with his collaboration with Armstrong in the Worldwide Church of God. But in interviews, Wolverton himself hoped to be best remembered for his biblical illustrations for the church. And I think that was for two main reasons. One, that his work had developed, it was more artistically compelling. He was a better artist, but the second reason is that he felt kind of a calling and a need to help Armstrong share his message because of sort of the stakes involved. And so I think part of it in the case of Wolverton hinges around sort of who he is in sort of public memory as a comic book artist. And then in the case of Armstrong, I think, there's been a tendency, I think, in discussions around his belief in British Israelism to sort of, and I see different histories or sort of ways in which his history has been presented, but in many cases it seems as if the inclination is to give Armstrong the benefit of the doubt, and that his notions of American exceptionalism can be just chalked up to enthusiastic patriotism, without sort of looking at what was behind his sense that America was chosen and who is included in that sense of chosenness and who is excluded. So I think with Armstrong, a lot of the focus tends to be on, well, his prophecies didn't come true, and so he's a failed prophet in that sense. But why he's maybe a failed prophet in other respects in terms of his the ideology behind his theology has received less attention. So I think there's probably different reasons for each of those two, but more broadly, I think maybe in the current moment, and I'm just thinking now of attempts, and not to get too far afield here, but with this idea of memory holding, like in the same way or in a parallel way that I think Armstrong and Wolverton tried to write and draw Black audiences out of God's blessings, the future inheritors of a kind of separate inheritance where each race would, achieve blessings in a separate sort of geographic area. We're seeing today, the White House issuing recommendations about language that can no longer or should no longer appear on federal websites, and terms like Black and woman and are not included, but white are allowed, and that sort of thing. And so I think there's these insidious ways in which we want to or push back against that. So I could probably go on a little bit more, but I think I should just stop
Sure.
right there for now. Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely. Carl, and I apologize. I think I talked over you a few minutes ago when you were trying to ask your question.
We jump in how we can when we can. No, we're good. And so my question to Dr. Woodyard, you made mention of truth and the acknowledging of truth. I think, and I'm trying not to go too much in a postmodern lens with this, but we see truth per se, objective truth, if you will, being produced in such a way that within even the framework of your presentation, Noah is white is projected as a type of truth. And so I know that we're trying to move anti-colonialist thought, post-colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. And so my question is there a way to generate a specific type of truth, or is truth generated in such a way to where we can move beyond kind of the hegemonic systems of truth that is perpetuated in white supremacy? Or what I'm trying to get to is how do we really get to what inherent truth is to move away to what has been portrayed as truth over the years?
Yeah, this is a big question that really requires a lot of reflection, but my initial kind of impression is that I think, apart from an idea, well, is there a truth with a capital T or that sort of thing? I think we can look at how the experiences and perspectives and self-interests of people like Armstrong and Wolverton have stood in place as sort of a universal when that is not at all representative. And so I think I've tried to do this elsewhere, is to look at which stories and perspectives are not being heard and elevated, and trying to bring those into a kind of counterpoint with these dominant narratives. And so I think, not that there's necessarily the tension and opposites or that sort of thing, but the idea that through that complication that arises when you're hearing different histories up against these dominant paradigms, you're getting more complexity and figuring out how the truth might be, somewhere in between, or that there's not just one. Although it may be a dominant perspective, it's not shared, and it doesn't reflect the experiences of genuinely most people, I would say. I don't know if that starts to get at it. I'm not sure of the answer, to be candid, but I think that's my sort of initial thinking about it. But thank you. I'll have to think about that some more.
Yeah. Yeah. Other questions for Dr. Samuels and Dr. Woodyard? Well, I don't want to rush it, but I also don't want to belabor it here. Dr. Johnson, I see you've unmuted here.
Yeah,
Do you have something
I'll
for us?
just if this is about um, if we are about to wrap up, I just want again to say that I want to thank the panelists for both Rohan and Kerith. Great job, and really talking about the construction of race, the rhetorical construction of race, and how race lives, and how we are, part of that, and we have to be aware. I mean, critical engagement comes to mind, to try to think our ways out. It's so embedded, it's in the soup, as they say. I mean, and so very powerful. And again, going back to an earlier question about, um, you know, I think it was Jackie that asked a question about, how does this operate right now, or how can we, learn from this? I mean, we're seeing it right now with our politics. The entire diversity merit debate is grounded in this, so this is, and people, and well-meaning people just honestly believe that there's one, going to Rohan's point, that there's one epistemological base that is just the right base, and that's what we should always be about. And when you come up against that, not understanding and knowing that whatever you think is right today probably was wrong when it came about during its time. And so the notion for rhetoric, the understanding of argument, and how societies and how people change is all rooted in understanding the rhetorical situation and rhetoric as this thing that can open us up, or, as we have seen too, can close us off and wall us up as well. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. So thank you again.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I echo everything to our panelists, Dr. Samuels, Dr. Woodyard. I totally agree with what you said, Dr. Johnson. This panel, just puts so well on display the necessity of the Center for the Study of Race, Rhetoric, and Religion. So thank you so much for your work. Congratulations, Dr. Samuels. My goodness.
Oh, yeah.
Congratulations on everybody doing well, everybody
You're right.
healthy, and
Yeah, everybody's doing good. Actually, this is my second child that we gave birth to. So it's been a crazy few days. But yeah, God is good. God is good.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well,
Okay.
we wish you a good night's sleep tonight. And yep, absolutely. You'll be needing that. And my understanding is that the next event on our schedule is the keynote at noon. Is that correct, Dr.
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes. Thank you. We have the keynote lecture from Dr. Michael Waters. And again, it is going to be on the subject that we were talking about earlier today in the first panel, on the Black prophetic tradition. And so, or the prophetic tradition. So stick around for that. It should be a wonderful talk. I've heard portions of it already, and it was so awesome that I invited him to come to share it with us today. So that's at 12 noon. Looks like we have some time to maybe go grab a bite, get another cup of coffee, or stretch our legs a little bit. So we will end it right here. Jeff, thank you again for sharing, and you will be back again today at 3 o'clock, I believe. Is that
3
right?
o'clock to 3:30. Yep, one of those. Yep, yep.
I think
Not sure. I'll check the schedule. Yeah.
right, But thank you again for all your help and getting this. Jeff and Jackie serve as my editorial assistants for the Journal of Communication and Religion that I have assumed the editorship over. So I want to thank them for their help in all of this as well. So until 12 noon, let's just take a break. We're going to stay right here. The Zoom room will stay open. And and we'll see each other at 12 noon.